Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
The Print Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in association with global insurance brokers, airline partner SpiceJet, in alliance with Indraprasth Apollo Hospitals.
If I tell you that my guest on Off the Cuff today is an author, each one of whose books I have read, it will tell you two things. One, it will tell you how brilliant the author is. Second, it will also tell you something about my taste in literature. Now, please don't judge me for that, because what Adrian Levy writes, along with his co-author Kathy Scott Clark, who's not with us, they work together on these books. They are a bit like Shankar Jaikishan or Lakshmikant Pyarelal of Indian music. We have only one today with us. They have become the domain specialists on dirty games, the dirtiest games being played by intelligence agencies, bad guys, global terrorist organizations, anywhere in the world. So this is the AFPAC region, but they also add India to it, because whatever happens in the region has connections also with India. Whether it happens in India, it happens elsewhere. So I serendipitously, I was looking at my bookshelf to check which ones of his earlier books I have. And I found that the first book that caught my eye was actually The Meadow, which was written some time back. And that is about that the kidnapping of 5 foreign tourists, one of whom was later beheaded for escape by the group supposedly called Al-Faran. And since then, these two have tracked intelligence proliferations and terror proliferations, all very closely on either side. Some of their more recent work, The Exile. The Exile was the story of Osama bin Laden hiding once he went into exile from wherever he was in Afghanistan, and how he got by until he got killed. I can tell you that story is more dramatic and more interesting and more credible than Zero Dark 30, because that story is devoid of propaganda. And that story also taught me something that I didn't understand earlier, that in trying to put down Al-Qaeda and focusing on Osama bin Laden, somebody took his eye away from bigger problem that was growing, that is the growth of the ISIS out of Baghdad. So that's one. The other is The Siege, which is a dramatic account of what happened 26/11, particularly in and around Taj Hotel. And there are many others. And now they have a book coming out on 14th of August in Delhi that Juggernaut will publish, called The Spy Stories. And The Spy Stories, it's the first book that looks at ISI and India's RAW. In each country, the other is sort of mythologized. ISI and India's RAW, how they fight each other, how they compete, what are their methods, what are their successes, what are their failures. So Adrian Levy, after this sort of rather long introduction, please tell us about your latest book and how this takes your story forward.
First of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you. We've been satelliting around each other for many decades now, through different iterations of our lives and careers. And so it's a pleasure, a particular pleasure for me to be on this show with you. And it's a shame that Kathy's not here. She's even though with COVID lockdown, she's working on an edit for a film that we'll be bringing out at the back end of the year. Which also
I've read the proof PDF.
Yeah, right. That's right. So there'll be things to look forward to at the end of this year. But this book began with an impossible dream. It feels like I'm going to break into song. We had this desire, having watched a brilliant Israeli film called Gatekeepers, to see if Gatekeepers, which is the story of how Israeli intelligence dealt with the rise of the two states, Palestine, Israel, but also the rise of the right wing in Israel, which ultimately leads to assassinations and chaos. And it's a remarkable record on film of thoroughly secret heads of the Shin Bet, internal security, giving overlapping histories where they contest a lot of what each other says, and and the film was both gripping and compelling. And if you've not watched it, anyone watching this, please go and watch Gatekeepers. I don't own shares in it, but I heartily recommend it. I watched that and I thought, one of the great rivalries, Kathy and I thought, quitting that movie, is ISI and the RAW. And in many ways, it's as important, if not more important, in that everything that happens in the fashioning of that rivalry, and that happens broadly within the region, has told us a story about ourselves and has illuminated something about the period that we live in now. And I'm not just talking about the the war on terror period. I'm talking about everything post-partition. It's been a fairground ride. It's been an extraordinary ride of political impulses, movements, wars, insurgencies that involve the great game, the invisible game, the lesser game. Gloved hands, lots of forces, both overt and covert, that are operating. It's the world's best story, the biggest story for us. And the idea that you could try and create some kind of oral history became our challenge. This immediately became apparent that the idea of putting this on film was not going to work because spies don't like to talk in front of cameras, and it would be challenging enough just to get a significant number of people who are both operators, clandestine, overt, analysts, etc., working in these two most secret agencies just to talk. We had one thing going in our favor, just to sort of get to the end of this rather lengthy reply, and that was that we've stuck around. Several decades later, almost 3 now, the people that we met when we were kids and who couldn't tell, Hizbul Mujahideen from Hezbollah, grew up alongside other sources who themselves became quite senior in organizations. And because we had a mantra from the beginning of not falling out with anyone and trying never to lie and never to deceive about who we are and what we're doing, we didn't lose many friends and contacts. And the result is that by waiting patiently, the right time came, and we all reached a point where this story became far more possible by being truthful with each other and offering each other an opportunity to use the platform to tell some stories about this great, bitter, and at times hearty rivalry.
So why would, I'm curious as a journalist, why would these shadowy figures living their secret lives and actually living quite vicious lives as well, very insecure, paranoid, why would they open out and trust to foreigners who come into both India and Pakistan?
I think the present war, as you know, is a war over truth. We can discuss all the other hot wars that have gone before, and all of those that have involved spies. But the present pressing war is over information, narrative shaping, and truth. And so the idea that people who have not who have a platform but have not been owned by any particular side and have had a record of trying to be as far as possible impartial and open to ideas is an attractive one for anyone who's got time to engage. And as long as you offer that platform honestly, you'd be a foolish person to turn it down. That's kind of what our pitch would be. But what's to lose? We made that pitch repeatedly for 6 years. Repeatedly, we came back with different versions of it and repeatedly screened movies and showed books where America articulates its worldview. America articulates its security priorities. Britain to a lesser extent, but America in particular is a great narrative shaper. And I think that message began to chime with a lot of people in India and Pakistan. It is a good idea to memorialize failure, to understand failure, and to celebrate success. It is a good idea to shape narratives, to engage with people and explain what the stresses and strains have been. There are a lot of people who still would not talk and don't adhere to that. There are some old timers who will take their secrets to the grave, both who you and I know quite well. And they're from a school where they believe, like the British security services, that a secret remains a secret. But there are plenty of other people on the operational level and on the analytic level who would like to memorialize what has happened. Some have political agendas. They believe they're dissatisfied with the direction that countries are going. They have issues in the way that agencies have transformed. They have concerns and worries about where India, Pakistan are at right now. And those people come freighted with certain amounts of caution because they have agendas.
In which country or in which agency did you find more of this concern? Where is my country going? In RAW or ISI?
In RAW.
In RAW.
Absolutely. ISI is actually, by its nature, quite a monolithic being, in that the army is the backbone and institution that, it is the tectonic plate beneath of which a fragile democracy is built. And yet, of course, India is the exact opposite, which is a robust, cacophonous democracy, peopled with, every kind of storyteller and intellectual, every kind of creative imagination. And yet there are concerns about the direction in which India may be moving. And so I do definitely think there were more voices articulated on the Indian side for that. And there's more self-criticism in India, let me tell you, far more self-criticism. Self-criticism.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a faculty, and yet it's one that isn't expressed by institutions. I think we've talked before. A very good example is 26/11. The belief of institutions post that catastrophe, the bloodbath, was that the soul searching should take place in secret, and the result is the Pradhan report came out, which is 69 pages. And one just couldn't believe that would be the public response to something, which was a watershed event for the world, let alone for the region. We came out of 7/7, and I can go down round the corner to the Kew National Archive, and I can read 150,000 pages of inquest reports, eyewitness accounts. And as you and I know, this has nothing to do with capacity. The capacity's there. It's to do with the political will. And so, my feeling was that there was a chance with oral stories to try and frame some of those concerns, to memorialize victories, to look at the different flavors within the organizations, the cultures that exist. And the other thing that's really startling is, and most important, is the similarities. The similarities that exist between the two different kinds of spy games that are being played.
So what are the similarities between RAW, RAW and ISI, and where are the differences? Give me two of each.
Okay, I don't know whether I can. I think the broadest one, and the one that would take the longest to explain, is that although Pakistan is characterized as the ISI in particular as an organization that prefers to use proxy forces, actually India and Pakistan both have been extremely successful using proxy forces. Pakistan's story, which is projected very loudly by India, and also has been the subject of much soul-searching vis-a-vis Afghanistan, etc., is a story of proxy warfare. I mean, from its inception and the creation of ISI, and the earliest operations prior to ISI with nascent young Pakistan, proxies were used in Kashmir to try and win that off, steer the state away from India. So, the proxy story is a story of Pakistan. Pakistan shaped proxies in the 60s and the 70s with the help of CIA. And the first thing they did as force multipliers, as you and I know, is focus on India's fault lines. And those fault lines included, Punjab, the Northeast, Kashmir, and America helped give them the skills that they would need to form paramilitary organizations that could then exacerbate problems inside those fault line areas. But at the same time, one can chart the way that this grows through, the Afghan-Soviet war, and obviously the growth of political Islam and Islamism. And then you have, your Lashkar-e-Toibas, and you have your sectarians with Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, and you have Hizbul Mujahideen growing up for the Intifada, the insurgency, in Kashmir. And then, this mitosis takes place as the cells split and they create new organizations, and Pakistan puppeteers a lot of these. But at the same time, India was remarkably successful, doing something very, very similar. But the difference between the two nations is that India didn't become the focus of those operations and projected itself as a benign state. I mean, the best example of how India experienced proxy warfare is, of course, East Bangladesh. It's East Pakistan, the Bangladesh war. And, a combination of extremely sharp intelligence gathering by a whole array of forces, the manipulation of groups and outfits on the ground, and the creation of proxy forces to puppeteer those actions led to a devastating result for India and a devastating result for Pakistan. And from that moment on, there was an instinct. Rahman, one of the great, for me, the great operators in counterterrorism.
B. Rahman.
B. Rahman, he's like for me personally, is a towering legend within Indian intelligence and within the analytic world. Extraordinary brain, a man compelled to make lists, even if you're having dinner. There'd be a notebook and a pencil, and there'd be a list of choices of what he would eat and where that might lead him. He looked at the idea of equivalence, and this idea of equivalence was voiced and acted upon. If CIA-backed paramilitaries would make the Northeast burn or inflame the Punjab, then why not do the same? And why not do the same in Karachi? Why not do the same in Baluchistan? Why not do the same in Lahore itself? And from that, little known and little publicized, India had its own kind of assassination units, broadly speaking, which led hits against Khalistan leaders who died in the region, not outside the region, not in Canada or the UK where the diaspora was, but inside the Pakistan, Punjab and other areas. They made outreach with Baluch nationalists, and even in later days with extremely incendiary organizations, including mercenary elements of the TTP, the Pakistan Taliban, and of course, one of the most ruthless groups of all, which Indian security attempted to deal with, was Jaish al-Adl, which is a group of Iranian Sunnis who were a minority living in Baluchistan, and who were used as proxies by CIA, ISI, and India in order to push back against Iran and wreak havoc inside Pakistan for reasons that we can discuss later. So there's actually a long history. And of course, one thing that I've missed out, the easiest and central operation would be MQM. The movement of migrators to Karachi is one in which RAW was an absolute expert in playing. And it found little slivers inside that movement who were looking for money and weapons and influence. And those people worked in the interests of RAW in India. Already, they were chastened by the Pakistan state. And those operations took place, led from the UK, from the High Commission. They took place often in Vienna and in other locations. And of course, the end results would be found in Pakistan itself. And so there is a long and storied history. Finally, just the final piece that comes into mind, of course, is Kashmir. And an idea that was forged by Indian intelligence was the creation of Ikhwan and renegades. And in 94, 95, when mass surrenders were engineered.
You talk about Kuka Pare and stuff.
Kuka Pare, and there are so many more. I mean, basically, there are hundreds of them, thousands, in fact, in terms of foot soldiers. And the idea of triggering mass surrenders in Kashmir and getting Kashmiris to fight Kashmiris was not an idea that was born in Kashmir. It's an idea that was born in Northern Ireland, in the 6 counties. And a group of intelligence officers were taken for training. They were placed with the Royal Ulster Constabulary in the UK. And there they got to see one of the world's most brutal and bloody counterinsurgencies, which involved, obviously, Catholic and Protestant communities in the 6 counties. And we don't need to tell the story of the IRA in this broadcast. The officers came back and they used what they learned from ruthless prosecution of that war, where organizations were infiltrated, puppeteered, and steered. And they did the same in Kashmir. They did the same in Andhra Pradesh. They did the same in the Punjab. And many of the events that you will see that take place, the dividing of organizations, the dividing the Hizb al-Mujahideen, the dividing with the renegades, the dividing of the Khalistan movement, which is a story that's been well told, and in Andhra Pradesh as well, with the Maoist struggles, took place with officers who honed their ideas in the 6 counties, and also then later had mentorship and training in Israel, where puppeteering and the use of these organizations was the ploy of Indian intelligence against Palestinian outfits like PLO, PLFP, Black September, etc., penetrate, manipulate. That became, a great mantra for Indian intelligence. And so, what we can see in this, just the beginnings of this conversation, is that there are many things that remain unknown that are never said about the success of RAW. I think about that quite a lot. Why is it that the focus has been on ISI? Part of the reason, I think, is because one of the great successes with India is to project itself as benign. It's probably the most brilliant success of Indian intelligence. Secondly, I believe it's because of the exercise of soft power, because brilliant Indians everywhere who are part of the wider diaspora occupy chairs in every great university and think tank. And they tell the story of India exceptionally well, but that story does not tend to be the story of the hot wars. It tends to be a different kind of story. And so Indian influence is exerted wonderfully in a way that Pakistan's isn't. And India has not had its Afghanistan. It's not had, its internal collapse, which Pakistan's had. And that means that the focus on the internal collapse means that we very much focus on the way in which Pakistan has been punished by its use of proxies, but we haven't with India.
Yeah. So there is something that Steve Cohen used to say. Steve Cohen, the South Asianist who you read and quoted, he used to say that India has left Pakistan behind in most areas, but there are 3 gaps. And he used to say one is the cricket gap, second is the hockey gap, third is the kebab gap. Now, over the past decade, we have filled the cricket and hockey gaps by some distance. Kebabs, I don't know. People will vote. But importantly, we in India have always believed that there was a spy game gap. There was an intelligence gap, not intelligence as in gray matter, but intelligence as in intelligence operations. That somehow ISI was this all-conquering, diabolical force, and RAW was bureaucratic and boring and had too much politics. I know you make a reference to that RAW somehow is given that reputation. Is that correct or not?
No, wrong. Yeah, totally wrong. It's a trope. I believe that, certainly RAW was left behind. I believe that, there was a period in which, despite all the early successes of RAW, particularly in East Pakistan, in Bangladesh, and in other areas as well, and despite, you being able to cherry pick other massive wins, including the Kargil War, where technical intelligence led to the ousting of Musharraf's little chat with his own COAS, and we then knew that the subterfuge of in the Kargil Heights of insurgents was busted. Formidable intelligence operation by India. And you could go in after that. India penetrated very successfully using technical means, GHQ. They were inside the computers of people who were adjacent to the nuclear program. And of course, they knew about Pakistan's nuclear program and its acceleration and passageway much before CIA. So there are plenty of wins. But as an organization, it's definitely true that up until the disaster of 9/11, I believe that RAW, despite these wonderful victories, got left behind. It got left behind financially because it just didn't have the illegal cash swilling through it that ISI had. ISI had loads of different kinds of unaccountable monies. It had direct elite covert funding from Saudi Arabia. It received covert funding from Turkey. It received revenues, as was charted very well by RAW, from drug running. And also from illicit sales of US equipment, etc., which was the excess baggage of the Afghan war. And it was paid heartily by the US for that episode, leaving it enriched and entitled. So, those events definitely stepped up. Plus the fact that, ISI as an organization became battle hardened. there cannot be many organizations in the world that fought for that number of years, inside the political world of Islamism against an army like the Soviet Union. So it come through that cauldron, and inevitably that would lead RAW to lag. There are other reasons that you and I know as well. There is a political instinct in India to be non-aligned. There's a political instinct of the peacenik in India. You and I know how long it took to grow a strategic culture in India, because strategic studies were never taken that seriously. And the early great strategic thinkers who I've admired and read struggled to get heard by successive governments. They were not taken seriously as a discipline. They were viewed basically as extraneous. There was always a great desire to keep the military and the government totally separate and let the government govern. The military would then be asked to do the chores of government. And of course, that is the subtle difference between Pakistan and between India, that space. That space is now closed. And that's something we can touch on in a bit. That space has definitely reduced.
Close. So 9/11, you say Pakistan and ISI stole a march because they got all this importance and all this unaccounted for cash and illegal cash, as you said. And RAW got left behind. How much did the gap grow between ISI and RAW then? And how and when was it bridged?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think there are several stages to this. RAW's focus, one of its focuses, let's say two of its focuses. We'll just choose two. We'll take two apples. One apple is that they're gonna focus on smashing the CIA-ISI pact. That is great intelligence. Why has America been duped by Pakistan again? Is the narrative coming from India, a nation that was sanctioned for proliferation, for its illegal nuclear program. From 92, the funding door is shut. The President Amendment comes in. Pakistan is an outcast, and yet Pakistan, through again, a lot of geographical and historic reasons and luck, ends up being the natural ally for America, that needs access to the Karachi coastline, needs access to the Kashmir Pass, needs access to the Durran line, and needs a security partner, that can look on Iran and look towards Afghanistan in the war on terror years after 9/11. And India is the instinct within RAW, both good and bad, is to smash that pact. So immediately they begin to try and come up with a whole array of psychological operations to smash that pact. And I think the best illustration of how that operation ran would be the Colin Powell plot. This is a very, very good example. CIA.
That's quite a story in the book that RAW sold his story to the CIA, that there was a plot to assassinate Colin Powell when he was visiting Pakistan.
Yeah, absolutely right, and it's a terrific piece of work, really. The CIA contact ISI liaison, and they say, Colin Powell's flying in to Chaklala, and we now know that he's there's this plot to kill him. The second stage of the story that makes it even better is that CIA say that they know who the protagonist is, and that the assassination plot will be led by Ilyas Kashmiri. Now, this is cause for concern because Ilyas Kashmiri's come through a decade of fighting in Afghanistan. He leads his own elite unit, which is known as the 313, named after the number of Muslims who fought in the Battle of Al-Badr. He is a man with a huge battle computer in his brain, but also someone who is brawny and has fought and battle hardened. He's also ideological, not dishonest, and therefore he is an adversary, to be worried about. America is worried about that. They drive the ISI mad. The third element of this operation that makes it a brilliant operation is that the CIA tell the ISI that the weapon to be used will be a US Stinger missile that will bring down Colin Powell's plane as it comes into land in Chaklala. Now, this is a sore point because a huge number of Stingers deployed during the Afghan Mujahideen days have gone missing. So what you have there is de facto a CIA enemy number one, Ilyas Kashmiri, using an illicit American weapon that they're fearsome of, bringing down Colin Powell. Now, if anything's going to fracture the American state, it could be that. As it happens, finally, Ilyas Kashmiri's caught, the plot is deflated, Colin Powell doesn't die, he sees both nations. That is a great example of manipulating your enemy. A second great example of trying to seize that space and shape the narrative is in sowing the idea that the ISI funded Al-Qaeda and the 9/11 plot. Brilliant work by RAW. It fed that story into a whole series of news agencies in India. It laminated together some cases that had happened in the past involving young Islamists, nascent Islamists growing up in India and operating in West Bengal. And it created a grand cake from this of truth and false in many different layers, which became a story that was so attractive that it then became the subject of the 9/11. Part of the 9/11 inquiry would be repeated for years to come. And it's one that shot through with a kind of Islamophobia. Islamic nation naturally, finds itself a bedfellow with Islamic terrorists. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. All the subsequent inquiries found out ISI did not fund 9/11. ISI was not akin or adjacent to Al-Qaeda. And General Mahmoud, who was the ISI DG, the big chief, who was dismissed. Yeah, he was kicked out for different reasons altogether. They wanted someone who was more American-centric. They wanted the great communicator, Ehsan al-Haq, to come in and do the job. Ehsan was a man who had traveled widely with enormous connections in the Gulf, a huge strategic brain, and someone who could ride the Americans and actually understand what was going on and reform ISI. But again, RAW, an extraordinary psychological operation, which then flavored the war on terror years to come. A recent book came out in Delhi in 2014 by one of the former bosses of the CBI, and he wrote in it about his early investigations into ISI funding of 9/11. That myth is pernicious. The seeds were planted by RAW, and they're still germinating today.
Yeah. So there is something that Seymour Hersh always says. I walk into his office whenever I happen to go to Washington just to listen to stories.
Yeah.
And he tells me that, and I'll ask him the same question, that you've seen both the agencies. Don't you think ISI is much smarter? And he says to me that ISI, that your RAW is as smart as the ISI. In some ways, they are smarter than them. But there is one difference. The RAW is not physical. ISI is physical. You go with that?
No. Absolutely wrong. No, don't go with that at all. I believe that RAW runs on two bases. Like any organization, it has a counterintelligence function, it has a counterterrorism function, it has an analytic function to one degree or another, and it has a sharp, pointy end. And its clandestine function is many-headed, deep, and operates widely from Chabahar in Iran through to London and Paris. Covert undercover officers are doing this work all around the world in real time to great success. The difference is that draconian secrecy laws and the culture that exists mean that you won't have your Manchurian Candidate movie made in India. You may get First Strike, you may get Uri, you may get a Bollywood version of this, but you will not get the real stories told by RAW officers. These operations do take place, and there are very similar tendencies that exist. If we could look at any of the storied events in Kashmir post 89 with the use of Indian proxies, and they would illustrate how dangerous these operations could be. Secret writing on the massacre that took place in Chhattisgarh shows that both governments in Delhi and Islamabad in Rawalpindi were not that sure about who the key protagonists were themselves. Their own internal documentation showed that the balance of probability showed that renegades had carried out that attack. The fact that they're even raising this in their own deeply classified space, which enables them to talk honestly, means that renegade plans run awry on every side, and there are plenty of these deniable style operations which have fallback. There is a big difference. The scale and ambition and the loss of control on the Pakistan side is vast.
Yeah. So you talk about Abdul Ghani Lone's assassination, and you say that wasn't carried out by ISI as an institution, but it was carried out by a vengeful brigadier.
Yeah.
Now, before you answer that question, I will tell you a story that I had heard from my Pakistani friends and later confirmed by Indian friends in the same areas, who said that the Bombay blasts of 1993, they were organized also by a brigadier in the ISI, who actually raised some money for the operations by himself, holding fashion shows with Indian models in Dubai, and ran the whole Dawood Ibrahim operation. So do you see, is this a pattern in ISI? And is it genuinely people working on their own? Or is it to get deniability for the institution?
I believe it's not. I think the organization is coherent and whole. And the organization totally repudiates the idea that it has breakaway cells and functions. What it does have is it has, I can't talk about that piece of information you have, but it has, and it faced, and this is the consequence of its earlier policies, a breakaway much larger than ever acknowledged that took place within ISI and within the elite special forces. So at a certain point, I think it'd be fair to say by 2000 and the dying days of 2002, 2003, an entire section of special forces had broken away from one company, Zural Company, who were the counterinsurgency sharp end based at Sabella Ghazi. And that section formed a whole series of different committees. And it had an Assassinate Musharraf committee, it had an IED committee, which was looking at insurrection in the cities, and a committee that went up to the Durand line. They worked with a huge number, a significant number, not huge, of former spies who broke away, and then also joined that amalgam, which mated with Al-Qaeda and formed a deathly stew. So what you see there is you see ISI and GHQ losing control of not only its assets, but also the disaffected who are trying to smash the CIA ISI pact. And so the mainstream of the state, Musharraf for his better and for the worst, are pushing on. And from that date, from 2002, they're being harried in the most bloody and spectacular way by specialists that they've trained, using munitions that they've stolen from government armories, guided by spies who formerly worked for the organization, who've got together with Al-Qaeda foot soldiers and logisticians who are working for Al-Qaeda and everyone else. That is a noxious brew.
So there is an ISI, there's a Directorate S, which you mentioned, and Steve Paul wrote a whole book about. And then there is all these freelance directorates, A, B, C, X, Y, Z. Is it?
They're not freelance, no. The organization is totally cohesive. They have their directives, which deal with internal, external, analytic. And then within those, they have horizontals, which are the desks. So they'll have horizontals that are looking at particular factions and flavors within the jihad movement, that are looking at sectarians, that are looking at hotheads, that are looking at organized crime.
I get that. What I mean is these other people who broke away and who were trying to assassinate Musharraf and who were trying to light up the cities, who were doing stuff with the on Durand Line, then became self-financing, self-driving, non-state actors.
Yes, that's exactly right. And, their command and control would change. I mean, there's the same group of people, basically, we could draw a line from 1984 until 2018, and it's the same bunch of people, the same bunch of bad actors. And it's remarkable, them and their children and their brothers. It's a small group of people. We can name them, Ilyas Kashmiri, he'll return again and again and again. Masood Azhar, his brothers, his father, the family and the clan. Amjad Faruqi, a foot soldier who would reoccur, all the way through all of these events, 84, 99, with the hijacking of IC-814, and then all the way through the war till his killing. Omar Sheikh, British trained, captured by India, escapes in 814, reoccurs. Danny Pearl involved in the periphery of this, etc., etc., etc. We can. There are folders which trace the bad, dysfunctional family of bad actors, and how that small family then roped in all these foot soldiers, the special forces, the former spies, and then they form a command and control council for these people who wreak havoc, mostly havoc, it has to be said, against Pakistan itself. I mean, there's an entire folder of attacks on Musharraf, which takes the number into the dozen. We only heard about the three that he thwarted, including the 2 car bombs. But I mean, there's many other attempts, bomb attack on a mosque, suicide bomb which stalled outside a shopping centre in Islamabad, a RPG attack, 2 RPG attacks on his plane. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And, you know, each one they take to pieces and they'd find the same components in it: disaffected airman, former spy, 2 special forces officers. Then you'd have LEJ element, the sectarian thugs who would join with the brains of Al-Qaeda, etc., etc., etc. And they have hierarchies. You know, they have a class system. So you have at the top, you have the Egyptians on the one side, who are the ruling class, and next to them are the elite leaders that include Ilyas Kashmiri. And right at the bottom, you have the LEJ knuckle draggers who've come out from obviously from Jang and the Punjab, and you also have the Yemenis, who basically are the disposable faction who are allowed to blow themselves up, etc. So it's, there's a class system in this. There's a caste system and a communalism.
Yeah. So just for clarity for our Indian viewers, Chakwala is the airport at Rawalpindi. It's a military,
yes, absolutely.
a military part of the airport at Rawalpindi. And also LEJ is Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, which is an extremist sectarian Sunni group in Pakistan. Its name indicates that it comes from the area of Jhang, which is in South Punjab. In fact, in India, there is a large population in Delhi also, which migrated from Jhang and speaks a distinctive language. Now, Abdul Ghani Lone assassination. Tell us the story.
So, in the case of Abdul Ghani Lone, it's a fascinating story because a free thinker can increasingly be an unattractive proposition, and somebody who will not necessarily toe the party line can cause problems. And in Kashmir, the Hurriyat obviously had been formed at the behest of ISI, and ISI had sent a young captain over to work with 1 or 2 other select officers to bolt together using a whole series of money, persuasion, and political tools, a conference of peoples and outfits who would broadly represent either autonomy or succession in Pakistan. And of course, as we know, it had a military council, which largely speaking became, although not exclusively, became Hizb al-Mujahideen, of course, and that would go in its own separate direction. But Abdul Ghani Lone was one of those people who was very much his own person, a free thinker, someone who had come to believe that there was no violent solution to anything, and that endless war only suited the prosecutors of the endless war, and that the people caught in the middle, the civilians and the wider Indian population, did not benefit from endless war. And a man like that caused problems. He caused problems because he wanted peace, and no one could guarantee which kind of peace he wanted. Was it a Pakistan peace, i.e. one in which Pakistan could revel, or was it an Indian peace put forward by I.B. Raw, who canvassed brilliantly for peace and came very near, almost successful to achieving a peace in the Vajpayee years? But that would, of course, cause a huge embarrassment in Pakistan. And so even the concept of peace becomes politicized. Whose peace wins out? Whose war wins out? Who becomes the figurehead for the movement that declares itself as that which resolves Kashmir and the Kashmir struggle? Ghani Lone was truly an independent actor. And he complains, never kept quiet. He had meetings with Musharraf where he'd lambast Musharraf really quite cruelly over his failure to have a more incisive Kashmir policy, even though Musharraf had started to turn off very successfully the Kashmir tap for insurgency and revolution in Kashmir. He lambasted I.B. Raw continually. He'd castigate them and say, when's this promised peace coming? But he also made a mistake, which I guess is one he was entitled to make, given the service and years of service to Kashmir that he'd given, and that was to complain about particular officers. And one particular officer who was on the Kashmir desk, who was known as a Brigadier Abdul, and Abdul is just a nom de guerre. There's always an Abdul, there's always an Iftikhar, etc. But this Abdul who filled this position, subsequently, as far as we understand it, was sacked. Or at least he was shunted to one side. And the result of that was that a huge amount of bitterness came about. And when he was shot at the Egar prayer ground and died alongside some of his security guards as well, all of the internal reporting points to that disaffected brigadier having engineered the plot using a series of mercenaries who were recruited in Kashmir. And so, you can have an operation like that, which is revenge, simply cold, naked revenge by someone with an ego who was squished by his own organization and then felled a fairly great man, a significant man, a man who wanted peace.
So you make an interesting point. You say that at this point, when Hurriyat was being created, ISI sent a captain to Kashmir. So an ISI captain was able to infiltrate into Kashmir, work with these guys, be safe and operate safely and never got caught.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he was there for quite, a decent mission length and came through. There are many different ways to arrive at Kashmir. In his case, which is perhaps the most surprising, he picked his tickets up in Bangladesh and then, made his route across. But there's other routes, including flying into Delhi with very, very specific covers and then coming up by road or going to Jammu and then through the Baniwal tunnel. And, and he was there. He had a legend and he was there to create a political consensus, which he never achieved. But he did bolt together a lot of people who disagreed with each other under the auspices of a conference to discuss their disagreements.
But Indian intelligence never figured out that somebody was there.
I don't think that's right. I think that the instinct within Indian intelligence is to know when these things are happening. But you're often better to allow things to play in order to watch the long and the medium game than you are to terminate them at inception. If someone's carrying a bomb in the old world order, unless there's a particular political directive, you'll want to stop that bomb exploding in the crowded market. But if there is a counterintelligence ploy at play to allow an operation to run in order for you to describe the wider network, then that's where intelligence operations feast.
I'll pick up the thread there, but before that, let me also ask you, Major Iftikhar, Namdegar, who you rely on great deal. So Major Iftikhar from the Pakistani side, ISI side, and an Indian secret agent, again called Monisha, now based overseas on the Indian side. You said Major Iftikhar was also freely visiting Kashmir Valley for operations?
Yeah. He'd also had a whole different way of coming. He used the land route. He had, at any one time, I think he must have had 4 or 5 different passports or identities. He had his own legend, his own story that was rehearsed, would fly into Delhi. In the case of the story that I tell, there were many other different ways. He was operating from a safe house in Gandarbal, part of a suburb, you could effectively call it, of Srinagar. He had very specific instructions that he carried with them over overlapping missions, advance the Pakistan form of peace, undermine the Indian form of peace, dismantle the overtly pro-Pakistan insurgency because it was an embarrassment to Musharraf and the American CIA ISI pact. And the interesting thing that Iftikhar tells us, having been in the midst of it, is how uncontrollable all of these forces were. But for 2 reasons, one of which is obvious and one of which is not, and which goes back to the first questions that you asked right at the beginning of this conversation. The first reason they're uncontrollable is that, these cells have a mind of their own. And by the time that Iftikhar is trying to engage with them in 2002, they're also against the ISI-America Pact. And so there's nothing in it for them. They will continue to do what they want to do unless, and until extreme measures are used. But there's another reason. And the second reason is that it suits Indian intelligence for some of these organizations to continue to operate because they're being used in extremely brilliant and well manipulated counterintelligence ploys. If you flip a Jaish fighter, why put that man in jail if you can put him back in the field? Because then he acts as a fly trap and he draws to him countless other people. And in a great counterintelligence operation, any number of people will be back out in the field who work for Lashkar-e-Toiba, for Jaish-e-Mohammed, for Hizbul Mujahideen, and they're talking to each other. They're talking to what intelligence calls popularly overground workers, and we just know as sympathizers, people who are sympathetic, underground workers, people who are armed, and they're forming a network, and that network is, will then go on to become an intelligence grid much later on in the Kashmir years, after 2014.
These are ISI officers. Coincidentally, they are also army officers, Pak army officers.
Yeah.
Would the RAW have the equivalent, that is officers from India also operating in sensitive parts of Pakistan?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think RAW's preferred way of working is through proxies, but it has done that. There are humongous risk takers who have been alone, on their own, on lengthy operations. Inside Quetta is one area in which they've operated. You know that moving across the Durran line into Fatah and Quetta has been a RAW specialism, even though languages have been an issue there. They've had people in Karachi who have worked, and in outlying European stations. And of course, we can talk about this later, but it's very important to focus on the Kulbhushan Jadhav operation, because the Kulbhushan Jadhav operation, your viewers may remember the very, very unfortunate story of the Indian naval commander who was seized in Pakistan, on where Pakistan rubs up with Iran, and then became a tug of war, between India and Pakistan over this man, who of course is married with children who are from Mumbai, family from Mumbai, and he became a political hostage, if you like, a bargaining piece. But his story, if we take that to pieces, illustrates something about the RAW ISI interplay. Somebody who was traveling with multiple passports, that projected him as being of a different faith to the one that his birth certificate suggests, that carry also mismatched details that gave away his story, because he was being informally managed by many different agencies. And in fact, that may be a terrible disaster for everybody, let alone, most of all, for Jadhav himself, in that I would say RAW operates with great professionalism. But the Jadhav story is not one of great professionalism. It's a hasty, ad hoc operation, fooled around in by a lot of different security interests, which ultimately will have sacrificed him and his family. And it's a good example of how a spy game has serious consequences, if the right amount of backing is not there.
Are you among those who believe that the Pakistani ISI colonel who disappeared somewhere on the India-Nepal border, has not been heard of since then, is a kind of bargaining chip vis-a-vis Jadhav?
I think there will be countermeasures. Definitely, I don't know from my own personal experience, but there will be countermeasures. Both sides keep very quiet about most of those countermeasures. They let each other know that the Jadhav story is explosive and has been fought in many different main domains, including the International Criminal Court. But there are also, it's a cautionary tale, in that it is not entirely a successful story for India. There are many successful stories for India and many extraordinary operations, and for our side, but this is a very, very cautionary tale. Basically, after 26/11, I think a lot of agencies wanted to be able to have an in with Lashkar-e-Toiba. Lashkar-e-Toiba, of course, was accused of being the prime organizer of the devastating attacks in Mumbai. And Lashkar-e-Toiba, no one believed that they'd acted on their own. There was a lot of belief in the American camp that Al-Qaeda was involved in the operation because of its logistics. And there was also a belief that Ilyas Kashmiri, that man again, was involved, because there's a certain level of planning. And in fact, there are more reasons to know that they believe that. They believe that because of NSA intercepts in phone conversations that took place using a brand new scheme run by GCHQ and the American NSA, which actually identified a communications hub, one in Pakistan, Kashmir, in Muzaffarabad, and another one in Karachi, which they penetrated. And conversations from there, live conversations, revealed the involvement of these elements to it. And at that time, such was the rage and competition that took place within the security services over the devastating Mumbai operation, that everyone wanted to have an asset that could get inside Lashkar-e-Toiba, and also that could be effective in in Karachi, where, of course, the Mumbai attack ship had sailed from to Mumbai, and Yadav, unfortunately, was one of those, you know, a kind of redundancy, if you like, a figure who was floating around, a bit of an also-ran, who became cultivated in an informal way without the training by many different people.
Yeah.
An asset, not an officer, an important distinction.
Yeah, he was a former officer, in fact.
Yeah.
Now, in your book, you suggest that Indian intelligence had information that there will be a marine attack on India. Did they also know that this will be on Mumbai?
Yeah. I mean, you know, this is something that you know, I've talked about before, and with you, I think that it's this is a very, very interesting sort of run up to this operation, which only came to light very recently. And it's certainly, I wasn't, Kathy and I were not holding all of these pieces when we wrote about it and published the book, The Siege. Subsequently, we learned that a lot of what happened came about because of the 7/7 attacks in the UK. When the intelligence services looked at the attacks on the London transport network, devastating attacks in London, they looked at what their failure was and what their success was. Their failure was that while they'd identified nearly all the people who were carrying out the attacks, they didn't understand the relationship between those individuals or the ways in which they were communicating, which enabled them to extract a wider pattern. And there was a failure to appreciate or organize the metadata, the pocket litter of every individual. And metadata is, for example, your calendar entries, the headers in your emails, your text message, dating and timing, the way that relates through contact chaining with other people who know you and your family and your extended family. And GCHQ, which is the premier agency for electronic intelligence, cyber intelligence in the UK, and NSA, which is the premier agency, National Security Agency in the US, set their coders and scientists and engineers and thinkers to solve this problem. How you could know that there were many actors, bad actors, but how would you be able to describe how they relate to each other? And broadly speaking, one of the things that they rested on was to look for the liminal spaces, which are the black spaces that you never normally focus on because you think they're patternless. One of them involves satellite communication. So where the world lights up with people using cheap satellite technology, that becomes an area to focus on and ground down on. The second one is in contact chaining, which is identifying everyone that you speak to and then working out their relationship with you. And the third is work out all those people who use similar devices like burner phones. A burner phone normally would be a single brand, one that you dispose, you may only use it for 2 days. And when these phones pop open and close, map that against geography and how they interrelate to other burner phones. And suddenly they had technology that enabled them to see what was previously invisible. That technology immediately led them to 3 operations. One was to understand what was going on in Iraq, which we'll leave for another day, which was to do with Al-Qaeda's operations and the bloodshed in Iraq. The second one was to do with operations that were taking place in the Durran line. And they identified 2 different factions in that. An LET faction, Lashkar-e-Toiba, anti-Indian, pro-Kashmiri, that was planning an operation, a live operation. And it related to a 3rd cell in Karachi where trained for the same operation. And they identified everybody in those 2 cells in that operation. And they called into bear 2 other agencies, including a visioning station that could even bring photographic and, you know, fingertip information inside those cells. They then traced, by monitoring those cells, found foreign entities connected to those 2 cells. These cells are plotting the Mumbai attack. They know Mumbai is the target. They know the number of people who are being recruited. They know not only that, where in the city the cells are likely to go. And by identifying a foreign, an attempt at a foreign recruit, which actually was in the UK, they then had a community, a cyber link inside the cell, a separate cyber link inside the cell through using a technology that we don't know about, which gave them a live ear. And what they did was they shared this inside the cell with Indian intelligence, and they shared some, but not all, of the highly classified data involving the burner cell technology and the description of those cells. So I think 8 months before the raid took place in Mumbai, all of that information has filtered down into RAW.
What happened? Why did the RAW not take it seriously enough?
Well, I think one can only conclude, one can only postulate here. We can come up with theories. Manisha and her kind, a group of people, believe that they didn't gain traction inside the organization. And the kind version of this says that complacency took place because RAW and IB was so successful at penetrating Lashkar-e-Toiba and Hizbul Mujahideen that they no longer really viewed them as an ardent enemy, and that they believed that they could be inside those cells, militarily defeat them without much of a headache. And so there was a lack of anticipation for the chaos that could be created with the capture of an entire city. That's the kind version. We could say that that would be the complacent story, a failure to gain traction, and maybe there's some personal issues. But Manisha identifies another trend within the organization, which you can trace right the way back to the creation of the proxy warfare within intelligence. And that trend is to allow things to run far longer in order that you get to see the big network and you create far more damage with your enemy. And there was a school of thought that perhaps if an operation would come about, that operation could be captured in time, it would also expose Pakistan, ISI, and absolutely once and for all kill off all American interest in Pakistan and tip things regionally in favor of India. At that time, India still remains largely unloved by the US. You know, it's got nascent pacts that began in 2004, but haven't really led that far. There's the nascent nuclear deal with India, the civil nuclear deal that's bubbling underneath, but it doesn't have, India does not have the ear of Washington yet in the way that it will after 2009. And these events are key in persuading Washington that, you know, the Indo-Pacific is a thing and that India is an entity that should be wooed ardently. And so you can see the logic with analysts inside Lodi Road, but beginning to question, although not having the evidence, is there a school of thought inside the outfit that would believe there's some benefit to capturing the entire operation, allowing it to run in a way that would expose Pakistan and fatally damage it? And, you know, we'll never be able to answer that, will we, until there's a proper post-mortem.
Do you believe in that hypothesis?
I believe that the outfit became more and more political and more determined to capture that space. And there may have been an anticipation that it would be thwarted at the level of its landing. The boats come in, the operation is wrapped up, Pakistan is humiliated. I mean, that can be the only explanation for why you'd have such pinpoint intelligence involving extraordinary depth by two very powerful agencies working with you as your ally, and you choose not to walk that forward. You know, I mean.
So tell us, who's Manisha? Don't give her a phone number.
Yeah.
Don't tell us.
Yeah.
First of all, is
it
genuinely a she?
Yeah, she was, co-opted, having got through to the elite of the Indian Administrative Service, which is the way that a lot of people come, their entry point into RAW. It was only much later that RAW created its own cadre, but otherwise it's still got these very bureaucratic methods of recruitment, which is one of the things that she railed at. Believe it or not, she was one of those people who'd always wanted to be a spy, in her case, an analyst, not a covert operator. And she was prepared to put up with almost anything to achieve that. Not only was she an extremely capable and academic person, as we'd expect of most people who are IPS or IAS based, the elite of the elite. As we know, it's a numbers game to reach that, you know, the few who get through that gateway. But she also had the fortitude and the strength to be against her type. You know, to be a woman, I think, in the organization in the 80s was no mean feat. Was a difficult feat. And I know things have changed quite significantly after 2001. But she describes those early days as, you know, tobacco smoke infused rooms, and I think it was a difficult enterprise. Also, women were not given covert placements. They were encouraged to be analysts. The training was much more rudimentary. The counterintelligence was much more rudimentary. I mean, she did a placement in Israel and was shown the way in which tracking took place for officers, and that tracking, which involved lie detectors, a kind of polygraph, and much more intensive counselling and therapy of the wider group that surrounded the friend, is career long. It's career long, and it's brutal in the way that it will just decide that someone now does not have the right psychological makeup and they can be removed. And India was much more ad hoc in its methods, and reliant on a less scientific approach towards the vetting of these officers. And of course, that would all transform as well during her lifetime in the organization. And she's someone, I think, who believed in the secular dream of India. I believe that, she was a very harsh judge of Pakistan. This is not a woman who is a peacenik or a pushover. And yet she, like other officers, like Heman Karkare and a few other people who I've named in the book, all reached a position after the appalling 26/11 attack that the flavors in the organizations begin to change in ways that upset, irritate, cause concern and worry within the organization. So that's definitely, she's one of those voices, and people who'd ushered us towards her, likewise with Iftikhar, said that we should look at people who didn't just represent the status quo, but had resisted in different ways. I think Iftikhar is, in a sense, a match partner for her. Iftikhar also resisted. He didn't, as Americans like to say, he didn't swallow the Kool-Aid all the way. He got to believe that there was innate corruption. And got pulled in all sorts of ways that reconditioned him. I mean, I think it's fair to say he became a terrorist. I think we can say that. And then pulled back, having seen, not being able to live with the casualty count, and seeing the consequences of that. Manisha was not pressed in that direction. She dug in deeper. She's one of the people who had access to NSA GHQ. She acted as a liaison in those conversations and saw the way in which intelligence and analysis can be a force for good and informs the greater world. And remember, it's a product, and the product gets passed to policymakers, and the policymakers use that massive insight to make good policy for India, good policy for Pakistan. But when that begins to change, and the manufacturers of the product are also the consumers, and they're no longer elucidating truth, but they're shaping narrative, then people begin to get worried.
The other officer you mentioned is somebody I admire greatly. That is Asif Ibrahim, and that's the real name.
Yeah.
He was director IB.
Formidable. Yeah. Extraordinary man. Extraordinary. I mean, one thing we should point out is that you may join, or lucky enough to be selected and chosen, but what no one tells you at the time is that you'll be working for 3 decades plus. A lot of these people are 36, 37 years in. That's 37 years of missing weddings, bar mitzvahs, parties. That's 37 years of day and night sweat. And, the romantic Le Carré-esque vision of the spy is not Asif Ibrahim's story. These are people who give their life to something that they believe in. And in his case, it's extraordinary because, as you know, with the winnowing out post-partition, the elite of Muslim officers went to the new Pakistan.
Right.
And that means that organizations were hollowed out historically, so that predominantly they were Hindu, but also with Sikh and minority Christian membership, etc., and other faiths, but predominantly Hindu. And then that would become a political virtue, which we could discuss later, much later on post the Mumbai attacks. But Asif Ibrahim, he grows up being a great cop, super smart guy, great cop, proves himself as both an operator and an analyst. Again, very rare qualities. Perhaps, someone like A.K. Verma, one of the legends of Indian intelligence, could be described as both of those things. And that means that, having been out in the field and working in the bandit belt and, having worked, learning to be a mentor and a coach to officers who do not have the bandwidth that he has, which means becoming a leader. He then moves from that to becoming a detective, and then he is pitted against all of the bad actors that we're talking about, this small bad family that cursed the region from 84 to 2018, everyone, Masood Azhar, Omar Sheikh, Amjad Faruqi, the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, the
Ilyas
LET,
Kashmiri.
it's the same, Ilyas Kashmiri, it's the same group followed by the same men. So the people chasing are the same, the bandits are the same, and they're tracking each other over these decades, getting older and older. And, along the way, some of them are dying. And then as some of them die, the chasers doubt they're even dead. I mean, one of the great chiefs of Raw is Rajinder Khanna, extremely clever man, who never could believe that the reports of Ilyas Kashmiri's death, in his heart, until he sees the DNA. As a man who understands intelligence and counterintelligence, he knows that death is also the cover for another life. And so it's in the nature of intelligence people like Asif Ibrahim, Rajinder Khanna, to doubt everything until the facts present themselves.
So 2 incidents where you have some skepticism, and I'm sure you will get a lot of criticism in India. That is Pulwama and Parliament attack. You don't exactly buy the story. That is what people in India widely believe.
Yeah, I mean, when I say buy, I think a lawyer said this to me. One can only believe what one is told. So one can look at the array of facts and reach a decision. Us as journalists, intelligence agencies as analysts, diplomats as diplomats, etc. We see the evidence and we judge the evidence. If we're not shown the evidence, then the story that's presented has been shaped. And so really what I have been looking at with Kathy in this book is the way in which evidence is shaped. And it's shaped by some bad actors, by people who have a record of being unreliable. And so understanding their trajectories and their motives and understanding what never turned up in court also explains why court never got a fair go. It's very important to say from the outset that while, and I'll get to this, while my conclusion may not be the same as some people's regarding, let's say, a very significant event like the Parliament attack, my belief deep down is not that the institutions are rotten or failing, the judiciary, the police service, and the intelligence services. Quite the opposite of that. But it's a belief that if information is withheld, then those services and those systems are stymied. And that is what I believe happened with the Parliament attack. Crucial pieces of data were withheld from the courts, from the police. And in fact, not only withheld, but some data was manufactured. And for the first time, we've managed to pull together the data that wasn't seen. So when you talk about us having, let's say, a controversial and different view, that view is based on information not seen rather than a reanalysis of data that is seen. And so if one could consider all of that data, then you see that there are many other people who reach the same conclusions as us, including really senior officers in the Intelligence Bureau, who also began to doubt from 2005 onwards, when certain things came to light, that the version presented to the courts was the right version. And by 2007, there's a concerted attempt by certain people within IB to push quietly for a reanalysis of Parliament attack, because it is entirely rotten and wrong for an organization to build its mythology and mythologizing on false assumptions. And instead, these people would like lessons learned and would like to know why it happened, what happened, and what can be done to prevent it. And so if you stymie that and short circuit that, this is bad for the long-term defense of India and the long-term offense of Indian security services. So many, many things were missing, and there are many bad actors. The bad actors include the principal cop that was involved in it, Rajbir Singh. The principal cop had a record, and his record related to his function in STF, Special Task Force of the Kashmir Police, or SOG. There's a confusion, one became the other, Special Operating Group, was there to handle the renegades. It was also like India's version of the French Foreign Legion. Anyone who was going to be fired or committed a crime within the force or was running away from an illegal romantic liaison, or basically had some kind of problem, would end up in the STF. And although the instincts were good when STF was formed, which was to get Kashmiris to own their own struggle And we talked to and interviewed in the Meadow officers who created it, and some really tremendous, legendary officers had the idea. It quickly became massively dysfunctional and a problem. People in it were turned and were flipped by people they were facing, or they were corrupt. A classic thing that affected Rajbir Singh would be, and other officers involved, would be that they would have access to weapons used by terrorists and would use those weapons in their own crimes, committing hold-ups, robberies, murders, settling scores, etc., all of which were then classified as Pakistan or insurgent events, when in fact they were just using the weaponry of insurgents. SDF has its own internal audit, which itself raised massive questions over the use of torture, unauthorized killing, disappearances, abductions and rapes, which have been documented by state human rights commissions.
He came to grief in the end.
Unfortunately, he came to grief in the end. He was murdered by a man who he was blackmailing for cash, who's now facing trial himself. But there's another important part of this story. The intelligence services themselves worried about Rajbir Singh. They worried about him continually. And when he got involved, having left SDF, he got involved in a narcotics operation, and he was shaking down the wrong people in the narcotics operation, and was actually working for the international supply group that was shipping narcotics into India. A section of IB leaked a transcript of what he was saying to lawyers in order that the case would collapse, so that a miscarriage of justice did not take place. This is a very rare occurrence. A classified piece of information using a covert collection means was leaked to the court to expose Rajbir Singh. But Rajbir Singh is one of the key players that's involved in investigating the Parliament attack. And the man that he's investigating and the group of people around him have prehistory too. And another officer working with them, Devinder Singh, who's currently in custody, facing an NIA investigation, has an even more problematic background, and now is in fact accused by NIA, and this matter will be discussed by judges in a court, of being a spy working for Pakistan, or at least an asset of Pakistan intelligence. He was caught, as your viewers will remember, in a car driving down the highway with members of Jaish and weapons and money, and they recovered their phones, and their phones, according to the NIA, who've created an annexure of the evidence from the phones, show an extreme, careless, badly managed liaison between some of these people and Pakistan intelligence. So now we know that the principals involved, in ways that were never shown to the court or to the investigating agencies, were themselves corrupt, and that the people who were working with them were most likely forced in certain ways to commit certain acts. Will we ever get to the bottom of that? I'm not sure, but we can look back and hope to learn, what went on. I certainly think it's worth analysing.
Pulwama.
But I actually think we'll probably agree with each other on Pulwama. I believe that I believe there's only a subtle difference in my reading of Pulwama and probably everyone else's. I believe that the work done on Pulwama is extraordinary, and I buy into it. I've seen quite a lot of the work that was put together by NIA, by the Border Security Force, the work that they did in capturing and analysing with lab work the handset that was recovered. And as your viewers will know, having read it in many, both in a great book by Rahul Pandita, The Lover Boy of Bahawalpur, and also in very good journalism that's been carried out in different outlets in India, that there was a Jaish cell that were behind Pulwama. I think these are incontrovertible facts. The difference is that I have a long history on the Pakistan side, and so I can bring perhaps to this story a bit of the knowledge of what was going on inside the Pakistan side. And the story told excellently on the Indian side involves the NIA operation and BSF's actions. So when you consider things more holistically, an interesting thing to see is the role of ISI. So it's in the nature of these things that the first reaction of Indian security services is to project everything as ISI. And yet what you have here, when you look back at the trajectory of the people involved, is many of these people had themselves being hunted by ISI, having mounted serial and repeated attacks on GHQ, Rawalpindi, Musharraf, ISI commanders, corps commanders, and they had set up a new base in southern Afghanistan in liberated territory, lawless territory near to Lashkar, in between there, and another place in Host, where they've been training and operating for some time. And in fact, the more nuanced story is that they were shut down, and a lot of their operations, barring the odious Masood Azhar, had been shut down. Masood Azhar was being used as an interlocutor by ISI. He was shuttling up and down, attempting to carry messages with another group, Jaish al-Adl, who were causing problems for the Chinese, and ISI manipulated him in every way they could. But broadly speaking, Jaish, as it existed in 2002, as a fully paid up asset of ISI, causing harm to India, that has ceased to happen. They were enemy number one. They melded with Al-Qaeda. They flipped into Afghanistan, where they continue to work with Al-Qaeda. And what you see in Pulwama, if you look at the timing and the people involved and the forensics of the bomb, is you see another attempt to create regional conflagration and bring Pakistan and India to war. And the reason I mention the bomb in particular is the incredible photos that came off that phone that show the bomb makers covered in aluminium powder, and that show the way in which a special kind of weapon was being built. It's the same forensic pathology of the device that blew up the Marriott Hotel, and a deeper analysis of the micro level of the architecture of the device and the weights and measures that it used show that it came from the 313 Ilyas Kashmiri. And so we know from that and the broader data that there's an intention here with that cell operating in Afghanistan, not in Pakistan, because their communications were also monitored by Western intelligence and NSA, talking in real time to Kashmir from Afghanistan, that this is an attempt to bring both nations to war. Whenever there's a cooling off, a new back channel opens up, someone will push the unending war button, the Holocaust button. 2611, push that button. Musharraf's back deal is almost, back channel is almost coming to fruition. Blow it up. There are those people, they are stakeholders in chaos. They do not want peace between India and Pakistan. And Pulwama is a great example. That slaughter, those brutal photographs, they're searing images for all of us when we look at that. But let's understand the forces at play here. It's not that the event didn't happen. The sacrifice was made. The terror happened. But whose purpose did it serve?
So you buy into the theory that there are forces whose only objective, the main objective, is to cause an India-Pakistan war.
Absolutely.
And benefit from the chaos.
Absolutely. They benefit from the chaos because, for example, in stateless lands, you can arm and train. Right. Afghanistan will be one such venture for them. The Iranian border is another. And they also benefit because, remember, war is a business. Like someone pays someone to do something.
These are conflict entrepreneurs.
They're conflict entrepreneurs, and jihad is at the sharp end. Jihad is like a hedge fund. They are the people who sit at the very top of venture jihadism. And venture jihadism is a very rich business involving mighty chains of finance that reach deep into the UAE and Saudi and the rich mercantile areas of the UK.
Now, you and I think we should sit at a pub. Because we can go on talking for several hours.
Yeah.
But we want people to read your book also. Now, on the concluding note, there are also instances you quote where the two agencies have worked together towards common purpose. And one of those, the first one was 1988, the meeting between Hamid Gul and Anand Verma. In fact, that is something that Anand Verma wrote about in the Hindu as well.
Yeah. Actually, it's a very unusual thing. Anyone who becomes familiar with these characters could not see a more unlikely coming together.
Absolutely.
Just extraordinary. Verma, abrasive, far too clever for most of the people surrounding him, workaholic, hard ass. A man with an extraordinary vision and drive, disliked by many people for all the wrong reasons. And a man who reformed and transformed intelligence and security thinking. And also an avowed hater of Pakistan, the Pakistan military, of course, not his people or culture, and a skeptic, a cynic, as a lot of people in the security organizations are. But he glimpsed an opportunity and an opportunity coming out of the Afghanistan conflict against the Soviets in the 80s, an opportunity to create a back channel that would prevent blowback. He was trying to cut off what would be blowback from Afghanistan to create greater problems for India, foreseeing what would happen to ISI, newly enriched, newly emboldened, having beaten the Red Army. And so, a meeting like that will only work if two hard asses get together. And that's exactly what happened. You had two ideologues, two unavowed nationalists for their own country, who are totally, I can't imagine two people with the least leeway, both mischievous, both prone to hyperbole, and who one could call, in the kindest possible way, extremists.
And they meet in Amman.
They meet in Amman, and the reason they meet in Amman is an interesting one, because the Jordanian royal family has an interest in this too, and some pressure is exerted on the Jordanian royal family, and they become the hosts for this meeting. And what's very interesting and isn't recorded in the account by Verma is that there are the on-the-books communications between the two titans, and then there are the off-the-books communications. And of course, in the pre-Pegasus, pre-Snowden era, pre-WhatsApp era, they had their own methods of exchanging notes and letters to each other via third parties, and believed that they had the short of each other and understood each other. And I think it may take two extremists like that to believe that a certain kind of peace was possible.
And then in the same year, Zia got blown up.
Zia gets blown up. I'm not going to subscribe or even air any conspiracies here, but Zia gets blown up, and Gul, of course, survives and carries on being the extremist, the lovable extremist that he will be for many years to come.
There's a TV clip from Gul, which I will send to you.
Yes, please.
It's a 2014 clip. He says in that TV discussion in Urdu, he says, we used American help to defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan. He said, in a few years from now, you will also hear, mark my words, that we defeated America using American help in Afghanistan.
Yes. I mean, he likes to sow a false trail as well. These are hugely complex times. Several lost opportunities. Musharraf's back channel through his schoolmate Tariq Ali, that should have worked. It came so close to working, to resolving a whole range of issues.
Which Tariq Ali are you talking about?
His best mate, his school friend, who was arraigned into setting up the back channel with India and creating a series of meetings that took place.
But what did he do, Tariq Ali?
He was working in nothing that's related to security. He worked for the income tax office.
Yeah.
And, he was basically a water carrier for two nations. So Tariq Aziz, sorry, not Ali.
Tariq Aziz, yes. I got confused with Tariq Ali.
Not the great Tariq Ali.
I said, that will be something.
No, that will be something. No, the great Tariq Aziz.
Yes, I know Tariq Aziz.
Yeah, basically more derided as somebody who's wasted an enormous amount of money on grooming his polo ponies, taking advantage of the Lahore flat season, but nevertheless was an enthusiastic interlocutor with India, and created real possibility of a back channel, with a far bigger, broader bandwidth than the one that began and ended so quickly in the recent year.
Adrian, before I let you go, do you think 3 years from now, you will again be writing a sequel to this? Is this an endless war, or you see this winding up at some point?
I'm broadly speaking an optimist. I always have been. I believe in, the reason for that is I believe in humanity more than the institutions. And as you yourself know, we would be treated as warmly in Amritsar as we would be in Lahore. And that's because the peoples are not the issues here. The geopolitics is. And we have to hold on to this even now at this time, where we're all filled with insecurity and we worry about truth and the nature of truth. My only concern here is that because intelligence wars and political wars have come together and the battleground is far more intangible, and that battleground involves knowing what is right and wrong, we may be more confused in 3 years' time. And Pegasus is an issue that will be around when this conversation between us it'll still be there. By that stage, today, when I logged onto the computer, I could see that there's an Israeli delegation on its way to the US, an Israeli delegation on its way to France. Macron will not take no for an answer. The only people who are not talking about this are India. India's not talking about Pegasus. And the reason India's not talking about Pegasus is because we're now at the pointy end of the proliferation of digital intelligence, and it has overtaken the capacity of legislature to act as an oversight authority.
That's a very good point. In fact, in your book, I also noticed that Major Iftikhar had some sense of it. So he was using, you say, only proton mail and wire.
Yeah, totally right. I mean, being careful with your communication, or in the case of non-professionals like yourself and myself, who are just curious people, nosy people, who are information gatherers, hide in plain sight. Never lie, be totally avert, wear the wrong clothing, and no one will mistake you for a professional.
Yeah, and always presume you are being heard, because that's what in fact, when people ask me in interviews, when I'm being interviewed, are you off the record, on the record? And I say, I'm a journalist, I'm never off the record.
Yeah, permanently on.
Permanently on. So thank you very much, Adrian. We miss Kathy. Please give her my best. And please keep doing the great work. I still would say that the exile, because so much has been written on Osama bin Laden, the exile, to my mind, is the best. And you are in very formidable competition there.
Thank you. Very kind of you. I've really enjoyed talking with you today, and it's great to hook up again. I hope to see you in the flesh as soon as COVID allows.
Absolutely.
Okay. Catch you for a pint soon.
Bhagwan kare, inshallah. Might take a chance.
Exactly. We'll wait till we're in the clear.
Absolutely.
Okay. Have a great evening.
And the best to Kathy.
I will do. I'll pass on your best. Take care. Bye-bye.
The Print Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in association with global insurance brokers, airline partner SpiceJet, in alliance with Indraprasth Apollo Hospitals.